Netflix has a new movie every week in 2021, and this week's is The White Tiger, based on the best-selling novel of the same name, in which an ambitious Indian driver uses his cunning and wit to escape poverty and rise to the top. I'm joined by my co-host Brandon and special guest Zane Bhansali.
Hey there, I'm Zane Bhansali. I first read this book when it came out 12 years ago, and as an Indian American kid, it was pretty important to me growing up. I read it like 20 times after that. I also happen to currently be an MFA student at the film school where Ramin Bahrani is teaching, so there's that.
Together we'll be charting Balram's journey and his climb to power as three key themes are developed throughout the film: his self-realization, how he is viewed within society, and how he sees other servants.
There's so much to talk about with this movie, so let's get right into it, starting where Balram does in the town of Lakshmangarh. He's a bright-eyed kid, he's good at school, and he's shown a promising future that explicitly won't take place here.
Who is this woman?
The great socialist, sir.
And what is the great socialist message for little children?
Any poor boy in any forgotten village can grow up to become Prime Minister of India.
In the jungle, which is the rarest of animals that comes along only once in a generation.
The white tiger.
That is what you are, the white tiger. I will ensure that you get a scholarship to a school far away from here, to our glorious capital, Delhi.
But Balram has to learn to grow up quickly once he is yanked out of school because his father cannot pay off the stork.
He was the landlord who ruled our village and collected a third of everything we earned. He fed so much on the village that there was nothing left to feed on. We feared his elder son, the mongoose, even more.
His bright future was no longer possible as he now had to break coal for a tea shop. This is the promise of Laxmangarh. His family has done this kind of work forever, and any thought of moving on is just out of the question because of the reality of paying the debts.
Yeah, if servitude is a contract, written or otherwise, then Balram signed it the moment he was born in Lakshmangarh, to the stork, the mongoose, the lamb, and any other members of the menagerie to come.
This is the idea of the rooster coop that's so central to the film and how it sees Balram as part of this restrictive system that's so ingrained that the first step is to notice it at all.
They can see and smell the blood. They know they are next. Yet they don't rebel. They don't try and get out of the coop.
Let's zoom out even further from Balram's immediate understanding of why he can't pursue an education in Delhi. Who owns the tea shop, or at least the land that it's on? And that initial promise of an education from the government official that visits Balram's school, that's an emissary of the great socialist who only appeals to the impoverished because they help fuel her campaign. Shuffle the roosters around in their cages. They don't even notice.
Once Balram sees the stork's son, Ashok, he sees a new ticket out. He wants to be Ashok. Balram almost worships the idea of being Ashok. Being able to hire another man to work for you is like Balram's dream.
I don't know if he's even aware of that possibility at this point. Like, the culture of servitude is so ingrained in him that there's just no way that he could envision a future where he has that kind of power.
It's practically love at first sight when he sees Ashok. The dreamy framing, the music swelling in, look at how head over heels Balram is. Ashok is the fairy tale prince, here to spirit Balram away to the life he's always dreamed of, and to give him that most revered privilege, to serve.
Every step Balram takes within society to claim some upward mobility requires literal mobility, and the first key he needs to unlock a higher class of servitude is driving lessons, which he takes in Dunbad.
This costs 300 rupees. There's always a cost.
When Balram does manage to get hired by the stork and Ashok, he's still happy to serve for the pride and the pleasure of serving. I want to be clear that he's not oblivious here. He knows that he's being taken for a ride, so to speak. When Balram offers to drive for a pittance, he knows just as well as the mongoose does that they're empty words. But if he lets that show for a moment, he's cooked. All servants understand the bend of the knee necessary to continue in service. That's why the gatekeeper can see through Balram's act so perfectly. But what does it matter if it's all a farce? Everyone participates in the pantomime. Everyone does their part. Ashok with his insistences that he's not actually a master, Pinky with her reassurances. As long as the servant's head is bowed, the master is pleased. And if he's not, he can always use a little corporal reinforcement if he deems it necessary.
Balram starts to learn more about himself and realize he isn't all what he thinks he is.
Do you know what the internet is?
No, sir. But I could drive to the market right now, sir, and get as many as you want.
Nah, it's okay. Thank you. Do you have Facebook?
Yes, sir. Books. I always loved books, sir.
Yeah, I heard you can read. Have you ever seen a computer?
Yes, sir. Actually, we had many of them in the village with the goats.
Goats?
Ji, sir.
The goats are pretty advanced to use computers.
I could tell from their faces. I had made a mistake.
Pinky, you see, he's got 2-3 years schooling in him. He can't read and write. Or he doesn't get what he's read. He's half-baked.
He has had everything presented to him, but without any way to utilize it. This is when Balram decides he must become more. He can't just sit by and wait to be the servant. He needs to do it.
Yeah, he's becoming conscious of how to play the game a little bit more. Balram starts to fraternize with the other servants, but his perceived destiny elevates him above them. He will be the #1 driver, he will go to Delhi, and he will use whatever means necessary to that end. Balram doesn't feel any kinship with the other servants. His allegiances lie with his masters, and of course, with himself. But he can still only conceive of progress within the confines of servitude. He may be climbing the ladder, but he's still going to end up underground.
So to get to Donbad, he was really playing by the rules. He gathered up the capital to invest in a tool, his driving lessons, with the promise of a return on that investment, which up to this point he's been making good on by sending most of his paycheck back to Granny and the rest of his family in Lakshmangarh. But there's a greater cost to move up to Delhi, and it requires the #1 driver taking the fall. He needed to exploit the rules of the game rather than playing by the book. And once he figures that out, he gets to accompany Ashok and Pinky to Delhi as they play a much higher level version of this game in bribing politicians to maintain their stranglehold on towns like Lakshmangarh.
Once Balram arrives in Delhi, he is presented with more wealth than he has ever imagined. Ashok and Balram almost become like friends. Like, they aren't master and servant, they are now a master and that guy you hang out with because you feel bad. But Balram still sees Ashok as his master or his father?
See how often he calls Ashok and Pinky his parents? It's more of the sycophancy that he practices as a rule, sure, but I think it's also a wish made manifest, a delusion that he is family instead of servant.
Once it is just Ashok, Pinky, and Balram, he soon learns to relax a bit, be a little less formal at times. Is this just because the constant reminders from Ashok not to call him master or sir? Or is Balram starting to take this job less seriously?
Balram is immediately introduced to a different class of servants than he's dealt with before. If the #1 driver is representative of the type of servant that Balram won't be in Donbad, then in Delhi, it's Vitiligo Lips, which is, by the way, how he's referred to in the script in the book. When Balram refuses to tell Vitiligo Lips how much he makes, he refers to him as a loyal dog, still blind to the injustice that he's being subjected to. Balram hasn't found this type of servant before, the type that will spit at his master behind his back right after dropping him off. And you know what? Balram's not about that life. Not yet. He doesn't have a reason to spit yet, or he doesn't see it.
But I do want to point out that as much as Ashok and Pinky and Balram feel like they can get away from the traditional structures of patriarchy and servitude when they go to Delhi, they're still all there to fall back on once there are real consequences to avoid. When a drunk Pinky runs over a poor child with their car, the stork and the mongoose are there to step in and make sure that if anyone is taking the fall, it's Balram, because he has the least to lose. They have to pay a price to cover up that violence, and while Balram doesn't actually end up taking the blame, it shines a light on how false their relationship really is.
Yeah, in Balram's belief that he is somehow better, somehow closer to his masters, he makes himself more vulnerable. The white tiger is rare, yes, more coveted, more constrained, given a cage all its own for its extraordinary status. The mongoose exploits Balram's imaginary family bond explicitly when making him sign the confession by calling him brother, telling him he's a part of the family. Balram signs the contract, but it's one that he already signed a long, long time ago.
Now, Balram is going to try and move upwards. He looks at himself and realizes some of the most basic things were never taught to him. Even a task as simple as brushing his own teeth was never taught. He just wishes he could spit his past out, just like the toothpaste he just did. Start over and just become a new person.
It's only by coming to understand just how low he actually is that Balram can start to escape. The very invisibility that is so dehumanizing is also what lets him start to take advantage of his masters on the sly. His reconciliation with the other drivers is the end of his idolization of servitude. And Balram immediately sees marked material differences as he starts to make some real money, and it won't be the last.
At the expense of his family. Like, he may be making more money now, but he isn't sending any of it home. He doesn't see any benefit in that because they keep threatening to marry him off, which would tie him down in Lakshmangarh and grind any forward momentum he has to a halt.
And at the same time, he's also trying to undermine his master. There are many times he is presented with the option to take the cash from the bag, but he doesn't do it, not because of some moral high ground or anything, mostly just because he thinks he is worth more. Thinks he is worth more than one bag of cash, worth more than petty theft. He thinks he needs to think bigger, think broader. He needs to start becoming a new person. He needs to start scamming his master, and soon he will become the master.
Right, just beginning to conceive of a world in which he's not the perfect servant eats at Balram, and it drives into psychosis and hallucinations. But those hallucinations are also what urge him forward.
My favorite of these is when he's in the car and he pictures his dad outside the window, who lays out to him the true scope of the theft that is required to keep the system running. Ashok's whole reason for being in Delhi is to bribe politicians to avoid paying taxes. Meaning, he's not just taking the fruits of all of Lakshmangarh's labor as a landlord, he's also not passing it up the chain where it can benefit more people. So, what are a couple million rupees in the face of generations of the upper class stealing from them and keeping them rooted to their caste? This is some really high-level thinking he's managed to unlock.
You have to wonder, is this what sets Balram apart? He's had a realization that Vitiligo, the other drivers, other servants presumably had years before. Understanding that you're worthless to your master is not exactly a new discovery. What is it that makes Balram the once-in-a-generation man who can escape the darkness, as he puts it? I'd contend that it's the ability to conceive of a definition of himself that doesn't even have the word servant in it. All of these servants have been trapped in the rooster coop their entire lives. Shedding that ideation of self is no easy task. Vitiligo may scoff at his master, but he still thinks of himself as a servant because the price of escape is far too great. Balram wishes that a man could spit out his past as easily as toothpaste. It's not easy, but it turns out that you can spit it out. But are you prepared for what happens once it goes down the drain?
Balram might not be prepared, but he goes for it anyway. He knows what violence can afford him, assessed what he's worth, and he takes it by force. Just like the 300 rupees for driving lessons, there's a cost associated with moving up in the world, but it scales. And with the knowledge that the future of Indian commerce lies in outsourcing, he travels to Bangalore with the last element of his family that likely remains, a nephew sent from Lakshmangarh to follow in his footsteps. He takes that initial investment and turns it into a driving service worth 15 times what he initially stole.
Now with the boy from Laxmangarh far behind him, Balram is determined to be better than anyone he has ever met. He isn't going to continue this cycle that he thought he would be stuck in forever. He is now the owner of a driving service, but he does respect his drivers, unlike his previous masters. He uses the money he makes for good? Like, he's not throwing the innocent drivers into jail. He's just using that money to bribe the police and also victims' families. Yeah, he's doing good.
He mentions the two ways to rise in power are crime and politics, but all we see from politics in this movie is bribery.
You don't want to pay the government? Pay me. 25 lakhs. And I mean it.
It's just crime once you have enough money to cover up violence or have others enact violence on your behalf. He's learned the tools of the wealthy and is using them strategically to break apart aspects of the rooster coop for others who come up after them, whether they're his drivers or his nephew who's growing up in this new system.
Balram is only able to transgress the division between servant and master once he fully views himself as a servant, taking advantage of the invisibility that grants him. He has to suppress his instinct to view himself as superior, one ingrained in him from his childhood. Balram's relationship to servitude shifts several times. When it's aspirational, it's all that he desires. But then once he has it, he goes to every length to distance himself from servitude until the final moment where he can shed it forever. Make no mistake, the Balram of Bangalore is no longer a servant. He may say CEO or entrepreneur, but it's clear what he really is, a master. He may call his workers employees and take responsibility for them, but he is a master nonetheless. Watch as he strolls through his office, the deferent hand waves, the paid respects, the bowed heads. Balram is certainly a more diligent master than his ex, as he so eloquently refers to Ashok. But Ashok refused to call himself master as well. He insisted that Balram was friend, family, anything other than servant. The linguistic gymnastics that Balram is utilizing are not something that he's invented. They're a tool of the master, used for generations.
What happens in a typical Hindi film about murder? Poor man kills a rich man and then gets nightmares about the dead man, pursuing him, screaming, murderer, shame. It doesn't happen like that. The real nightmare is the other kind, where you feel like you didn't do it, that you didn't kill your master, that you lost your nerve, and that you're still a servant to another man. But then you wake up. The sweating stops, your heartbeat slows, the nightmare is over. You did do it. You killed your master.
After Balram finishes telling his employees about killing his own master, he addresses the audience, his wall of drivers backing him up.
I've switched sides. I've made it. I've broken out of the coop.
And then, his story finished, he walks off camera. No mind paid to the drivers who remain. He turns his back on them, just for a second. To Balram, they are an army, an armada who prove his newfound status. But I see something different, a pack of tigers, hidden in plain sight.